December 17, 1944. 3:42 p.m. Somewhere in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Belgium. Hauptmann Klaus Richter crouched inside the captured American command post, his hands trembling not from the cold but from what he held, a single reconnaissance photograph, slightly crumpled, showing an industrial facility that stretched further than his exhausted mind could comprehend. The image had been found in the pocket of a dead American officer, carefully folded and marked with coordinates and production schedules that Richter's intelligence training told him were authentic. It showed the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, a facility so vast that the entire German tank production capacity could have fit into one of its assembly halls. As Richter studied the photograph under the flickering light of a captured American lantern, calculating the implications of what he was seeing, tears began streaming down his frostbitten cheeks. His fellow officers gathered around, and as each man looked at the photograph, the same expression of devastated comprehension spread across their faces. They had known Germany was losing the war. They had suspected American industrial capacity was significant. But this photograph proved something far worse, that Germany had never stood a chance, that every tank they'd painstakingly assembled by hand over months was being matched by American factories producing dozens in a single day, that the war they were fighting had been mathematically unwinnable from the moment the first American factory converted to war production. This is the story of that photograph, of the men who saw it, and of the moment when German military professionals confronted the terrible truth that courage and tactical brilliance could not overcome the simple, brutal mathematics of American industrial supremacy. To understand why that photograph broke these men, you must first understand who they were and what they represented. Klaus Richter was 34 years old in M. In December 1944, a professional soldier who joined the Reichswehr in 1929, before the Nazis came to power, when Germany's military was restricted to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles. He'd served in Poland, France, and 3 bitter years on the Eastern Front, where he'd been wounded twice and decorated for bravery more times than he bothered to count. He was not a Nazi ideologue, he'd joined the military as a career, not a political cause, but he was a patriot who believed in defending Germany, who'd convinced himself that the atrocities he'd witnessed were isolated incidents rather than systematic policy, who'd compartmentalized the moral horror of the regime he served because the alternative was desertion or death. By December 1944, Richter commanded a mixed battle group, the remnants of 3 different units thrown together after their original formations had been destroyed in the Normandy campaign, rebuilt with whatever men and equipment could be scraped together for Germany's last desperate offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans would call it, was Hitler's final gamble, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest designed to split Allied forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace that would allow Germany to focus all remaining strength against the Soviets approaching from the east. Richter had read the operational plans with growing horror. The offensive required capturing massive American fuel depots because German units couldn't carry enough fuel for the planned advance. They were literally betting on stealing enemy supplies to continue their attack. It required perfect weather to keep Allied aircraft grounded, because German forces had virtually no air support while the Americans could call in hundreds of fighter bombers that were once skies cleared. And it required speed, surprise, and luck in quantities that professional soldiers knew were impossible to guarantee. But orders were orders, and the alternative to attacking was waiting for the inevitable Soviet offensive that would drive into Germany from the east while American and British forces closed from the west. So on December 16, 1944, German forces had attacked through the Ardennes in a storm of artillery and armor, achieving complete surprise, overrunning American positions, capturing thousands of prisoners and vast quantities of equipment. For the first few days, it had felt like the old victories, France in 1940, the early days of Barbarossa in 1941, when German tactical superiority and aggressive leadership had overcome material disadvantages. But Richter was experienced enough to recognize the difference. In 1940, the Wehrmacht had been a fresh, well-equipped force facing opponents who were unprepared and poorly coordinated. In 1944, Richter's battle group was composed of teenagers and old men, equipped with a handful of tanks that constantly broke down, supported by horse-drawn artillery because fuel was too scarce for trucks, facing an American army that seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything. The captured command post where Richter found the photograph had belonged to an American battalion that his forces had overrun in the early hours of the offensive. The Americans had fought stubbornly before retreating, and the post had been hastily abandoned with documents and equipment left scattered across the frozen ground. German intelligence officers were sorting through the captured materials, looking for useful tactical information, unit dispositions, radio frequencies, minefield maps, artillery coordinates. Instead, they'd found something far more devastating than any tactical intelligence could ever be. The photograph had been in the personal effects of a Captain James Morrison, an officer who'd apparently worked in industrial logistics before being commissioned and sent to Europe. There was a letter with the photograph, from Morrison's father who worked at the Chrysler facility, describing his pride in his son's service and his own contribution to the war effort. The letter mentioned production figures, numbers that seemed impossible, that had to be exaggerated, that couldn't possibly be accurate. Except Richter knew they were accurate. His intelligence training had taught him to assess source reliability, and everything about this photograph and its accompanying documents screamed authenticity. This wasn't propaganda meant to be intercepted. This was a personal letter from a father to his son, containing information that should have been classified but was apparently so commonplace at home that workers could casually mention it to family members. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal, according to the documents, was producing M4 Sherman tanks at a rate that exceeded total German tank production by a factor of 3 to 1. And it was just one of several American factories doing the same thing. The photograph showed assembly lines where tanks moved through production stages with automotive efficiency, where standardization and interchangeable parts meant that repairs and maintenance were simple, where the same industrial techniques that had made Ford and GM dominant in civilian automobile production had been turned to military purposes with devastating effectiveness. Richter did the mathematics in his head, calculations that made his chest tighten with the realization of what they meant. Germany's entire tank production capacity in 1944 was approximately 19,000 vehicles, including everything from light reconnaissance tanks to the massive Tiger IIs. American production of just the Sherman tank, not counting other armored vehicles, not counting the tanks being produced by Britain and the Soviet Union, was over 40,000 in the same period. And American production was accelerating while German production was declining due to bombing, resource shortages, and the loss of industrial regions to advancing Soviet forces. But it wasn't just the numbers. It was what the numbers represented. The photograph showed something that went beyond simple industrial capacity. It showed a completely different philosophy of warfare, a system that German military thinking had never properly understood or prepared for. German tank design emphasized quality over quantity, technical superiority over mass production. A Tiger tank was undeniably superior to a Sherman in almost every measurable way: better armor, better gun, better optics. But it took months to build a Tiger, required specialized parts that couldn't be scavenged from other vehicles, needed extensive maintenance, and cost resources that could have produced multiple simpler tanks. The Americans had made the opposite choice. The Sherman wasn't the best tank on the battlefield, but it was good enough, and there were thousands of them. If one broke down, there were spare parts everywhere. If one was destroyed, 3 more would replace it by the next day. American tankers could be trained quickly because the tanks were relatively simple to operate. American mechanics could repair them in the field because the parts were standardized and interchangeable. And the sheer numbers meant that American forces could afford to take casualties that would have crippled German formations. Richter passed the photograph to his second-in-command, Oberleutnant Hans Weber, a 26-year-old who'd been a promising engineering student before the war. Weber studied the image silently, his face going pale, and then he began to cry. Not sobbing, but silent tears streaming down his face as he calculated the same brutal mathematics that Richter had already worked through. "We never had a chance," Weber whispered. "From the beginning. We never had a chance." Other officers crowded around, each taking their turn to study the photograph, each reaching the same terrible conclusion. These were not cowards or defeatists. These were professional soldiers, men who'd fought for years, who'd achieved victories that military historians would study for generations, who understood warfare at a level that only comes from years of bloody experience. And they were crying because they'd finally seen clear evidence of something they'd suspected but refused to believe, that the war they'd been fighting since 1939 had been unwinnable from the moment American industrial capacity entered the equation. Germany had believed that its superior military tradition, tactical doctrine, and technological innovation could overcome material disadvantages. This photograph proved that belief was a fatal delusion. You couldn't outfight an enemy who could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. You couldn't win through tactical brilliance when the enemy could afford to make mistakes and simply try again with fresh forces. You couldn't achieve decisive victory when the enemy's industrial base was not only larger but was located across an ocean where German forces couldn't touch it. The tears that flowed in that frozen command post weren't just about tanks or production numbers. They were about the realization that every German soldier who died since 1941, when America entered the war, had died for a mathematically impossible cause. They were about the understanding that Hitler's grand strategy had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare, that industrial capacity, not martial valor, was the ultimate arbiter of conflict between industrialized nations. They were about the horror of recognizing that Germany's leaders had known these numbers, or should have known them, and had sent millions of men to fight anyway, sacrificing them in a war that mathematical analysis would have shown was unwinnable. Richter had spent 3 years on the Eastern Front, where German forces had faced Soviet industrial capacity that dwarfed their own. Soviet tank production had been massive, over 100,000 armored vehicles during the war, and German forces had been slowly ground down by an enemy who could absorb catastrophic losses and keep coming. But Germany had consoled itself with the belief that Soviet equipment was crude, that Soviet tactics were wasteful, that Germanic military superiority compensated for numerical disadvantages. The photograph destroyed that consolation. American equipment wasn't crude. American factories produced not just quantity but quality that was more than adequate for purpose. And American tactics, supported by unlimited supplies of fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles, didn't need to be brilliant, they just needed to be competent and persistent. Attritional warfare, which Germany couldn't afford and had therefore tried to avoid through tactical brilliance and speed, was exactly what American doctrine embraced. Americans could afford to lose 3 tanks for every German tank destroyed because they had 9 tanks to replace them while Germany had none. As night fell on December 17, 1944, Richter sat in the command post while his men tried to rest before the offensive resumed the next morning. He should have been planning the next day's operations, studying maps, coordinating with adjacent units. Instead, he found himself staring at the photograph, understanding with terrible clarity that everything they'd accomplished in the past 2 days of offensive, the territory captured, the Americans killed or captured, the supplies seized, meant nothing in the larger context of the war. Germany could win every tactical engagement, could demonstrate superior tactics and courage and skill, and still lose because the mathematics were inexorable. For every German tank destroyed, it would take months to replace. For every American tank destroyed, the replacement was already rolling off an assembly line in Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania. For every German soldier killed, the replacement pool was limited and shrinking. For every American soldier killed, the replacement would arrive on ships that Germany's shattered navy couldn't interdict, carrying equipment produced by factories that German bombers, what few remained, couldn't reach. The next morning, Richter's battle group resumed the offensive as ordered. They advanced, fought, destroyed American vehicles and captured positions. But the photograph haunted him, colored every tactical success with the knowledge of strategic futility. When they knocked out 4 American tanks with their single remaining Panther, he thought about the fact that those 4 tanks represented perhaps 2 days of production from one American factory, while the Panther that destroyed them was irreplaceable and would eventually break down or be destroyed with no prospect of replacement. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, and German forces achieved significant local successes. But American forces simply absorbed the attacks, gave ground where necessary, called in air support once weather cleared, and then methodically crushed the German penetration with firepower and numbers that made individual German tactical victories meaningless. By January 1945, the offensive had collapsed and Germany had lost tens of thousands of men and nearly all of its remaining mobile armor reserve, resources that could never be replaced, sacrificed for an operation that had been doomed before it began. Richter survived the battle and retreated with the remnants of his unit back into Germany. He still had the photograph, carefully preserved, a reminder of the moment when illusion had been stripped away and reality had revealed itself in all its brutal mathematical clarity. As Allied forces closed in from east and west in the spring of 1945, as German forces disintegrated and the Reich collapsed, Richter would sometimes take out the photograph and study it, wondering how different the war might have been if German leadership had understood these numbers before sending the Wehrmacht to conquer Europe and challenge the world's industrial powers simultaneously. He surrendered to American forces in April 1945, was processed through the POW system, and eventually returned to Germany in 1947. He'd carried the photograph through the war's final months and through his captivity, a talisman of hard truth in a war built on delusions. In the decades after the war, as he rebuilt his life and Germany rebuilt from ruins, Richter would occasionally speak about that December day when he'd seen the photograph and understood that Germany's defeat had been inevitable not because of any failure of courage or skill, but because modern war between industrial powers was ultimately decided by production capacity, resource access, and economic scale. The other officers who'd seen the photograph that day had similar experiences. Some didn't survive the war. Others returned home to build new lives in a Germany that had to confront not just military defeat but moral catastrophe as the full scope of Nazi crimes became undeniable. But those who survived carried the memory of that moment, the tears, the realization, the understanding that they'd been fighting for an impossible cause. Hans Weber, the young engineering officer who'd cried when he saw the photograph, survived the war and eventually became a professor of industrial engineering at the Technical University of Munich. In his lectures, he would sometimes reference that day in the Ardennes, using it as a case study in the relationship between industrial capacity and military capability. He described the photograph, which had been lost somewhere during the chaos of surrender and occupation, and the moment of understanding it had produced. We were taught that warfare was about tactics and strategy, about leadership and courage, Weber would tell his students. And those things matter. But they matter within boundaries determined by industrial and economic reality. Germany's military was excellent. Our tactics were innovative. Our soldiers were brave. And we lost anyway. Because we challenged opponents whose industrial capacity made our best efforts meaningless. The photograph showed us what we'd refused to see, that we were craftsmen competing against mass production, that we were fighting a 19th-century war in a 20th-century industrial conflict. The specific photograph that Richter found was never recovered. It was lost somewhere in the chaos of Germany's collapse, perhaps destroyed, perhaps sitting forgotten in some archive. But its impact rippled through the lives of everyone who'd seen it, a moment of clarity that cut through propaganda and self-delusion to reveal uncomfortable mathematical truth. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal that the photograph depicted continued operating after the war, transitioning back to civilian automobile production, the same factories and workers who'd built 25,000 tanks during the war returning to building cars and trucks for peacetime America. The building still stands, repurposed for other uses, a monument to industrial capacity that had helped win World War II but was itself just one piece of an American industrial machine that had been unmatched in human history. The strategic lesson that the photograph represented, that industrial capacity ultimately determines outcomes in wars between industrial powers, became conventional wisdom in the Cold War that followed. Both the United States and Soviet Union built their military doctrines around maintaining industrial and economic strength that could support sustained conflict. The nuclear age added new dimensions, but the fundamental truth remained: you can't win a long war if your enemy can replace losses faster than you can inflict them. For the German officers who'd cried that December day in 1944, the photograph had represented something more personal than strategic lessons. It had represented the moment when they'd understood that their sacrifice, their comrades' deaths, their nation's struggle had been for a cause that mathematical analysis showed was hopeless. It was a moment of devastating clarity, stripping away the myths and propaganda and self-deception that had sustained them through years of war, revealing the cold equations that determined historical outcomes regardless of human courage or tactical brilliance. Richter lived until 1982, long enough to see Germany rebuild, prosper, and take its place as an economic power in a Europe transformed by peace. In his final years, he wrote a memoir that was never published, describing his experiences in the war with a focus on that moment in December 1944 when he'd seen the photograph. The manuscript ended with a reflection that captured what that moment had meant. We were professional soldiers who believed that our training, our tactics, our dedication could overcome material disadvantages. The photograph taught us that modern war is mathematics before it is courage, that industrial capacity determines outcomes more surely than battlefield valor. We cried not because we were cowards, but because we understood in that moment that every soldier who died under our command had died for a cause that arithmetic had proven impossible. We cried because we'd been blind, and sudden sight is painful. We cried because the numbers in that photograph were more devastating than any weapon the Americans possessed. They proved that we'd already lost a war we were still fighting, that we'd been dead men walking since the moment America's factories converted to war production. They proved that courage and skill, the qualities we'd been taught mattered most, meant nothing against an enemy who could simply outlast and overwhelm us through sheer industrial scale. That is why we cried. Not from weakness, but from understanding. As the war in Europe ground toward its end in the spring of 1945, as Allied forces converged on Germany from all directions, the lesson of that photograph was being confirmed in cities and fields across the continent. German forces fought with skill and determination, achieving tactical successes, inflicting casualties, making the Allies pay for every kilometer of advance. But the outcome was never in doubt. American tanks rolled forward, and when they were destroyed, new tanks replaced them. American supplies flowed from factories that German forces couldn't reach. American soldiers advanced with the confidence of men who knew that their nation's industrial might ensured that losses could be replaced, that defeats could be overcome, that persistence would eventually triumph because the mathematics were on their side. The photograph Richter had found represented more than just one factory or one weapon system. It represented a fundamental shift in how wars were fought and won, a shift that World War II had made brutally apparent. Industrial capacity, resource access, economic scale, these determined which nations could sustain modern warfare and which would be ground down by the sheer weight of material disadvantage. Tactics and courage still mattered, but they operated within boundaries set by industrial and economic reality. For the men who'd cried that day in December 1944, understanding this truth had been both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant their defeats hadn't been due to personal failure or inadequate skill, they'd been fighting against mathematical certainties that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. Devastating because it meant that the sacrifices they'd made and witnessed had been for a cause that was doomed from the start, that leadership had committed them to an impossible task, that courage and dedication hadn't been enough and could never have been enough. As darkness fell over Europe on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the photograph's lesson stood confirmed in the rubble of German cities, in the millions of graves, in the utter defeat of a nation that had believed military excellence could compensate for industrial disadvantage. The tears shed in that frozen command post in December had been prophetic. They'd mourned not just Germany's inevitable defeat but the death of an entire way of thinking about warfare, the end of an era when tactical genius and martial valor could overcome material disadvantage, the beginning of an age when industrial mathematics would determine outcomes more surely than battlefield courage ever could. And as the sun set over the scarred landscape of Europe, over fields and cities that had consumed millions of lives in 6 years of total war, the photograph that had broken those German officers remained a ghost, lost to history but present in memory, a single image that had captured in stark industrial reality the simple truth that would define modern warfare, that courage without capacity is futile, that skill without resources is insufficient, and that in wars between industrial powers, the nation with the factories will ultimately defeat the nation with only the fighters, regardless of how brave those fighters might be or how brilliant their commanders. The tears had been for more than one lost war, they'd been for the understanding that in the modern age, some battles are lost before they're fought, determined not by valor or tactics but by the cold equations of industrial production, and no amount of courage can change that mathematics. Only acceptance remains, and the bitter knowledge that sometimes, seeing the truth clearly means understanding just how hopeless your situation has always been.